welcome back to World Series News. Now, the counterintelligence report that we published just a couple of days ago is getting a lot of positive feedback from the audience who have been talking to me both privately and online in various different areas. And we're going to continue that today with another report of international news all around the world. And when you start to see these pieces to come together, you realize what's actually going on out there with the moves and counter moves. Now, let's start. There's a lot to get through, and I'm going to run you through some headlines very quickly in this monologue. Then I'm going to bring Simon in, and we're going to talk about it in detail. So for those of you without the time, a couple of suggestions. You can fast forward to different sections if you want the detail on certain information. You might just like to get the headlines. It depends again on what you've got and what you're listening to. But a number of my friends are telling me that they're playing this particular news now because it is so intense with so much information off their phones via Bluetooth in the car, so that you get the best of both worlds. And we do have them on Podbean as well, so you can download the podcasts there. So Jason Q Citizen, the page on Facebook, World Series News also on Facebook. You'll get the various different links in all of that. But let's get on with it. Now, in Australia today, on the Today Show, they are reporting out of Victoria there is a series of construction company collapses, and the Victorian government is trying to work out a way how they can allow building companies to adjust a fixed price contract in favour of a construction company to somehow protect them in case they're going to go under. This when interest rates are just 3.6% cash rate. One has to wonder how it is that a construction company working on margins of perhaps 20, 25, 30% can somehow go under at this stage, and the home buyer on an already prepared and approved finance contract is meant to cover the difference. A $500,000 construction, a 2 or 3% increase is $10,000 or $15,000 on the bottom line. This is not good thinking from the Labor Party, the party of the working class. Also in Australia, AstraZeneca is gone. The vaccine has now been taken off the schedules, and 40 million doses, according to former politician Craig Kelly, has now got to be destroyed. 40 million doses. I'm going to ask Simon about that shortly, why it is that the Australian government would have ordered 53 million doses of AstraZeneca when it wasn't even in favour behind Pfizer and Moderna. There's got to be a reason why the government would be ordering that many, particularly as a virus will mutate. And we've already seen bivalent vaccines being introduced and go down that pathway as well. So what are we actually doing? And it makes you wonder what the news were thinking back in the day when the Oxford University scientist was being praised as the great genius of vaccines for this particular AstraZeneca, which has now been taken off because of safety concerns. Very, very interesting. Also in this show, we're going to talk about what the Ayatollah in Iran has just come out. Massive news there from a tweet that's coming on. Iran and Saudi Arabia will be meeting in China. Why China? And also the EU Commission President van der Leyen and Emmanuel Macron also heading over to China. What's going on there? We know that van der Leyen is going to be admonished by the Chinese for her comments. And then we're going to explore some more news with the EU lashing out again to China for their support of Russia over Ukraine. And Jacinda Ardern, just now no longer the Prime Minister of New Zealand, appointed to two separate charities. One on misinformation, can you believe that, after what she's done to New Zealand? And the other one, the Prince of Wales, Prince William, has appointed her to be some form of international climate change expert. You can't make this stuff up. And of course, the big story of the day is Donald Trump being arrested and arraigned and pleading not guilty to 34 charges. So in all of that, don't go anywhere. This is the one and only World Series News. I'm going to bring Simon in right now. Simon, welcome back to World Series News.
So doesn't it seem incredible that you've just read out those headlines, and that's literally in the last 48 hours? There's just so much happening. It is incredible. And I quite understand why normal people with, a missus and a couple of kids in school find it incredibly hard to keep up. And that's not because they're not interested, but it's just because they're being whacked left, right, and centre. It's like you've been attacked by like a whole gang of muggers and you're trying to decide which one to fend off first. So you've done an excellent summary there, and we'll try and get through all of those in the time allowed. And I do encourage people, if there's a subject that they're just not interested in, not to give up, but jump forward or backward and use the time summary so that you can get the most out of this broadcast, because we genuinely are bringing you a lot of information that the Australian, New Zealand and English mainstream media just aren't bringing to your attention.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Look, it's really important that there are many, many people who have switched off the mainstream news in the past, and there'll be many more soon switching on other forms of news when they're realising that things just no longer add up, as we covered in the last two shows we did together, Simon, on World Series News. And so it seems that such a biggie, of course, is this whole AstraZeneca situation, that you can just destroy 75% of a 53 million dose order. Why do you think it was there, Simon, that the Australian government would have ordered so many doses of all of these different vaccines for a population of only 26 million people?
Well, if you're very sceptical, you might think that the politicians were on a percentage kickback, and if they wrote the biggest possible contract with out waiting for the next election and installment payments, then that's how you do it. You'd write the contract for the biggest number possible in order to get your kickback, hypothetically, for the largest bottom line number. But it, as you've well said, when AstraZeneca was a monovalent, a single strain vaccine that was likely to have to be adjusted, it was an extraordinary large number. And people forget that even though the man and woman who were the principal researchers at Oxford University, they didn't get to become billionaires like the bloke in Germany with BioNTech, but they did get a damehood and a knighthood, and they also had the honour of both speaking, and this alone should make you somewhat cautious about consuming their products. They both got to be the guest speakers at the 100th anniversary dinner of the British Eugenics Society.
Say no more. It is absolutely vile, isn't it, what we see today in this world? That
it's literally demons and goblins dancing in your front garden. It's like completely out in the open.
Yeah. No, it's just extraordinary. Now, with what's going on now, I think we should probably go straight to the Trump story and get your take on what's going on. This is the image that has been broadcast all around the world today. You've got the former President Donald Trump sitting in a New York courtroom on the 15th floor, somewhere like that, being arraigned and charged with some 34 different felonies in this case, attracting, as many media pundits are trying to say, a potential prison term of 130 years. I mean, this is absolutely preposterous, Simon.
Well, unfortunately, it is very, very common in the United States for both state and federal prosecutors to what they call overcharge. So they'll charge you with like 6 or 7 overlapping offences and then hope that you'll plead guilty to one of those, and then they whack you with like 10. But that's assuming that you take a pre-trial agreed outcome, which is less common in Australia and in the United Kingdom, where judges don't really like being told in advance what the decision is. But in America, particularly in federal cases, that happens about 90% of the time. So people are facing like 100 years, and then even their own lawyers tell them, well, I'll fight this for you, but it's going to cost you $2 million, and I can get you a deal where you do 5 and you'll be out with time off for good behaviour, or you might go away for 50 years and never see your wife and kids again. So it's a very, very high stakes game. People were anticipating that he was going to be facing something like 19 or 20 misdemeanors, which means they weren't really very serious offences. Somehow they managed to elevate them all to felony counts, which basically means that they have a lot longer individual jail sentences. And the one thing that didn't happen, though, is he wasn't put in handcuffs, and he didn't have a mugshot taken, and they didn't do a pre-trial confinement, because a lot of people were speculating whether or not, because of his enormous wealth, the judge would take the view that he was a flight risk and put him into like pre-trial detention, which politically was going to be unacceptable. But in the end, they just released him on his own recognizance. So he hasn't even had to post, like a $5 or $10 million bond. And he has immediately returned to the state of Florida. And he has announced, despite being told to be very careful what he says on social media, because the prosecutors complained that they were already getting threats in response to some of the statements that he'd been making on social media. He'd used the phrase that if he was detained in New York, that could result in death and destruction. So they implied that was a threat against the city of New York, which the judge took very seriously. So he didn't put a gagging order on him, but he did say that he had to be very, very careful about what he said on social media. So he's flying back in. He's going to arrive soon. And he said that he's going to give a public address at 8:15 p.m. Florida time, which is in 55 minutes. But he's terribly unpunctual. So at the earliest, that's likely to be 9 p.m. Florida time. So you'll have to look at on the news, and your listeners can check online to see what he has to say for himself when they hear this broadcast a few hours' time. But the other thing that's been revealed is that the judge, who had been involved in cases concerning several of his business associates, has made contributions that would appear to the local Democratic Party. So he's clearly got a political interest. And, I've always found that very surprising. And in Australia and Britain, you'd never see a judge making public donations to a political party, particularly if they deal in administrative or government law. It's quite extraordinary. But anyway, so they've found public records of that. But the really amazing thing is that it turns out that his daughter is a Democratic political consultant, and she had worked on one of the Adam Schiff campaigns. Yeah. So he was one of the staunchest anti-Trump members of Congress and led the first impeachment proceedings against him. So one of that guy's employees is the daughter of the judge hearing the case. So, that on its own should be enough to have the judge recuse himself, because even if he's estranged from his daughter, which there's no indication that he is, just the on-the-face appearance of it is clearly not appropriate. But there's, it seems to be going ahead. The next hearing is going to be, just in case everyone's holding their breath, breathe, because the next hearing isn't going to be until December the 4th. And the prosecution have asked for a January trial date, and the defense lawyers have asked for a spring next year trial date. So that would be April 2024. So we're a long, long time away, and he would never be incarcerated, I don't think, until he'd exhausted all his appeals. So you'll have the court of first instance, then the Court of Appeals, then the state Supreme Court, then potentially the federal Supreme Court. So it's not even going to be over by the time that they have the primary elections in the 2024 presidential race, which I believe would start in end of July, beginning of August, depending on when people hold their elections for that. So the whole thing's just a charade. It's intended to peel away independence. But the only really substantial things that they've alleged is that supposedly he was paying people off who were aware of alleged shenanigans or misdeeds. So obviously everyone knows about the porn star, but that was $130,000. Supposedly, another woman who claimed that he had had sex with her got paid. And once again, this is in the indictment, so it's just what the city prosecutor is alleging, that she got $150,000, and that the doorman of his building, who was seeing him coming in or out with various women, also got paid off $30,000. Now, if he had done this from his personal money, it was no issue at all. The issue is whether or not it was either from his company accounts, which was kind of like defrauding the shareholders, or whether or not it was from his political contributions. So those weren't legitimate political expenses. But it's also been suggested that there's some larger underlying crime that the prosecutor has discovered, but that he hasn't actually charged him with, and it isn't specified. So we don't know whether it's kind of like, murder or rape or jaywalking or littering. Literally no idea what it is. But supposedly that was part of the reason why he was paying off even more people. So it's very odd that we've got this kind of big underlying alleged crime that isn't specified, that supposedly has induced him to make some of these payments that weren't kind of specifically sex related. And then he also banged in a conspiracy charge because supposedly other people were aware and helped him facilitate the necessary bookkeeping entries and falsified kind of building entry logs and stuff like that. And by putting in at least one conspiracy charge, it enabled the prosecutor to put into the record a lot of evidence that would otherwise have been excluded as irrelevant. So he really has thrown in like everything he could conceivably think of, apart from this other mystery thing, which is obviously going to be left hanging over Trump running into the election. Because anybody who's aware of the full facts will be saying, what's the mystery thing? What's the mystery thing?
So, looking at the bigger picture in all of this, the delays are a very big deal because this could go all the way past the general election next year and still not even be resolved. So it's something that they're going to want to have to hang over his head. 34 felony charges on a billionaire. I mean, if it costs him $100 million in legal fees, so be it. But at the same time, we're learning today that on the Ninth Circuit, Donald Trump Jr. has tweeted out on the Ninth Circuit Court of whatever, $121,000 costs have been awarded against Stormy Daniels to Trump in all this just today. Have you heard about this?
Yes. So $121,000 on top of $500,000 that he had already been awarded against her, but so far he hasn't got a penny of that because she's claiming that her lawyer Michael Avanti, who ended up himself going to prison for trying to extort money with false allegations, I believe it was against Nike, the shoe manufacturer. He basically got stripped of his law license and imprisoned for trying to extort them for millions and millions of dollars. And she claimed that he had taken all of her money that she had given to him to manage because she was a porn star and supposedly didn't know what she was doing. And so she's claiming that she can't afford to pay him anything. But in theory, she owes him now $621,000. But it's already been stated that she's going to be called as a witness in the case, which it's just extraordinary because she's already acknowledged in writing that she didn't actually have sex with him. Now, there's a contention that she said that because she was paid to say that. But I mean, at the end of the day, you're greatly diminishing even further, if one assumes that is possible, the international reputation of the United States. And like all over a few $100,000 for a billionaire. I mean, he probably spends that like on a weekend like road trip.
Exactly right. It's astonishing, isn't it? Now, this is the she's now saying that she'd said something in a book that was published later to refute those claims. But goodness me, in terms of credibility of a witness, if this is what you're going up against a former president of the United States, you'd want a little bit more than that. So we sit here and we just scratch our heads in this great big show. All the world truly is a stage at this point.
But see,
Simon, yeah, go on.
just very quickly, the irony of this is that Trump is way ahead in the theoretical matchup for the Republican Party nomination. He's like 20% ahead of Governor DeSantis of Florida. Okay, so that looks a good position for him. But when you do a matchup of Trump versus Biden, bear in mind that Biden is like a Dan Andrews type character. I mean, if you can't beat him, you know, really, you've really got to be considering your life in politics, right? And so when they do that matchup, Trump's like tied or losing by a few percent. But when they do the matchup of DeSantis, even though he's the second favorite candidate for the conservatives, for the Republicans, he's actually like 5% ahead of Biden, because the independents and the Democrats are actually impressed with the job that he's done governing Florida. So actually, the best outcome for the conservatives might be Trump being knocked out the race for one reason or another, and then DeSantis running, because in the polls at the moment, he's a clear national favorite, if not a party favorite. But, you know, there are so many conservatives who are just cultishly invested in the whole MAGA phenomena that they're willing to continue backing Trump, whether he's convicted or not. And despite his misjudgments on the lockdowns and the jab programs and stuff like that, and not firing Fauci and not firing Birx or Redfield or Azar, any of those people that he had disastrously appointed or left in office or promoted, even worse, even when people were begging him to do so and get rid of them. So, you know, it may be a Pyrrhic victory if he has a trial, let's say in March, and he wins on everything, or even if he loses on a few things, and the judge fines him $1 million, hypothetically, just like a guess outcome, right? And then he goes, right, you know, here's $1 million in. So even if he were to pay the fine and then still run in the primaries, win convincingly, there's a distinct possibility at the moment that he would then lose in the general, even if there's no cheating. So, I mean, wouldn't that be an incredibly ironic outcome for him to go through all of this for so many years and then still, even in a fair election, lose again? And the point of whether or not it will be a fair election is something that's still very, very much in doubt, because, you know, all of these shenanigans started in, if not 2016, then definitely in 2018, when the Republicans lost control of the House of Representatives. And here we are in 2023, and these underlying problems still haven't been fixed.
It seems that nothing wants to be fixed in the United States at the moment. It doesn't matter how long an investigation continues for. We just sit there and we watch and we watch and we watch. And yet we read about, for example, in the Russiagate special prosecutor investigation with John Durham, that he's recently filed some more court filings in that are obviously pointing higher up the food chain. But this is a case that just doesn't seem to ever reach a conclusion.
But literally, like, John Durham, his work output is that of like a one-handed blind man. I mean, you'd never think that he has a whole team of high-fluting lawyers working for him. He's like fantastically slow. And many people think that the reason why he's so slow is he's just allowing the 70-year statute of limitations to run out on all this stuff.
That's interesting, isn't it, in itself? And yet we're talking about statutes of limitations here in this particular Trump trial. But of course, it's the new charges that have come up to turn them into a felony that makes it so interesting and juicy for those that are watching on. I'm just surprised in all of this. Before we move on to the Iranian story and continue with our world news, is just how little there seems to be gloating amongst Democrat supporters and Trump haters at this stage. It's almost as if they're too confused or are thinking that maybe this is all just another smokescreen.
Well, you've got to bear in mind that he's been impeached twice. They've been promised prosecutions and let down on numerous occasions. And even they have now come to doubt the validity of the 2020 election. So there are some pundits who are kind of like gleeful, but they had all wanted literally to see him in like a bright orange prison suit with handcuffs on, like walk down the steps of the courthouse. And they didn't get any of that. So, I mean, it was a bit of a circus because a lot of conservative commentators had told their supporters not to go and demonstrate outside the courthouse because they feared they'd be arrested and, like the January 6 people, held in detention for like a year or two pending some minor charges. So a lot of people didn't go. There was an enormous police presence. There was some woman who was dressed as a police officer and her son was wearing a Donald Trump mask. And she was just sitting on one of the city benches, like at a bus stop. And there were so few protesters to actually be interviewed by all the international media crews that she told one of the American TV stations that by the time everyone up and they were packing to leave, that she had been interviewed by people from all over the world by over 30 media organizations.
It's incredible, isn't it?
It's just because she and her son were in fancy dress.
Yeah, amazing, isn't it? Because and if people are trying to say that the MAGA supporters are the violent ones, they're really truly kidding themselves. They've never been violent at any stage in any of this. The videos that we saw of the insurrection certainly put a different bent on all of it. But this was the expectation on social media amongst the Trump supporters that no one was actually going to go along at all in all of this, and yet we see these particular trans protests getting out of hand all around the world. And we're learning to see that it's very, very different. And of course, the same in the George Floyd riots that went along, and that was all swept under the carpet as well. There can only be a certain amount of tolerance before the general public starts to really scratch their heads and ask questions in where we're going, Simon.
Well, I'm sure that you and I, Nicola, have been saying that kind of thing for 3 years now, and we've been repeatedly disappointed, right?
Yeah, and that's the problem with all of this, but we continue along. Now, Simon, if the US is intent on destroying itself, then its opponents in all of this, in what appears to be a restructuring of the planet, a great reset, a new world order, and perhaps even a new era, these BRICS currency, or the BRICS countries, I should say, who are working together, never cease to amaze at just how quickly they're able to put things together. Now, let's go to a tweet from the Ayatollah himself about what he's put up today, and we'll build from there in terms of the narrative that's coming out in real time in international news. Take a look at this from Khomeini. The global order is on the verge of an important political upheaval. This upheaval has two main features. It is taking place very quickly, and it is weakening the front of the enemies of the Islamic Republic. Tell us more.
So, it's undeniably true what he said. The current situation in the Middle East, with peace breaking out pretty much everywhere except Yemen, is not in the strategic interests of either Israel or the United States, who were the two main enemies of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so, we're in this bizarre situation that even people who may have considered themselves politically conservative for the last 40 years are reading statements from Xi and Putin and Imam Khomeini out of Iran and saying, that looks completely true. There's no propaganda. It's real simple. It's 2 or 3 sentences, and I can't find fault with a single word. And culturally for us, that is a complete reversal of our, entire upbringings and our identifications of friend and foe. And this is exactly what countries like Saudi Arabia and South Africa are now experiencing. Even those who have been closely associated for years with Britain or with the United States are like, well, hang on a second. Like, this guy's telling me the truth. These other people have been viciously exploiting me. And I think I can cut a better deal. And so that's what we're seeing happening right now. Just as we've discussed on the last couple of shows, there's just the most unbelievable flurry of diplomatic activity. So I'll just give you a real brief summary. So the Tunisians are appointing an ambassador to Syria. The UAE have just sent, he actually arrived today, a special elevated status ambassador to Syria. The Syrian deputy foreign minister was meeting with the Iranians and the Turks in Moscow, having a second crack at a peace deal and a Turkish withdrawal from northern Syria, which will leave the Americans completely hanging out there, which frankly, they shouldn't be there anyway. So, their time has come. I just hope they get out safely. And whilst all of that was happening, the Iraqis and the Saudis and the Iranians were meeting with the Omanis in Muscat. The Bahrainians said that they were happy to contemplate doing improved relations with the Iranians that they've had very, very difficult relations with for many, many years for religious reasons. The Jordanians have said, and you have to bear in mind that they're the closest Arab nation with Israel, that they would be willing, for positive religious reasons, to now have better relations with Iran. It's been announced that as soon as the ambassadors are exchanged, that there's going to be a joint Saudi-Iranian chamber of commerce to facilitate business transactions between the two countries. And what happened late last night is one of the Iranian finance ministers, not the top one of the kind of sub-ministers, he announced that they had done $80 billion of tentative business agreements, largely for the oil and gas sector, which is completely dilapidated. He said that only 5 billion of those are formal contracts, but that as soon as the diplomatic relations are restored, he's hoping that the next 75 billion will be quickly concluded. And then he announced that they're looking for another 80 billion because he said that their oil and gas sector is so dilapidated because of US sanctions, which still exist, that they want more money to increase their production by 50% by 2027 or 8, I think he was saying. Now, there's a few things to just pick apart there. So if it's dependent upon there being Saudi diplomatic relations, that would tend to indicate that a lot of this money is coming from Saudi Arabia. And you may recall that when we spoke on Sunday, before this news came out, that I said to you, I guarantee the first thing that will happen after the ambassadors get exchanged is there'll be a whole flurry of...
And there it is. And apologies if you've lost audio there. We're having a few internet difficulties today, such is the way of the world at the moment. But Simon, I'll get you to continue. And I just want to bring up this particular graphic because this is going to tie it all in together for our viewers today, that Iran and Saudi foreign ministers to meet in Beijing just next week. This is very interesting. And why are they flying to Beijing to have such a meeting, Simon?
So the headline's slightly wrong. It's not next week. It's next Thursday.
Okay.
So it's like in 2 days' time from me. And the reason for that appears to be, there's two reasons. One, as the Imam Khamenei said, everyone's in a frantic rush. And it kind of makes you wonder, why are they in a rush? But there's some underlying reason why everything's been done at this incredibly frantic pace. Because generally, with the Chinese and the Arabs, and this may be biased, I guess, but you assume that they move at kind of like a poetic, relaxed, we'll do it tomorrow kind of pace. But that's not the way this business is being conducted at the moment. So on Thursday, President Xi is supposed to be meeting all afternoon with old Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Union.
Mm-hmm.
And he's meeting briefly with her and Macron, and then Macron Wednesday afternoon. And then he's taking Macron on a pilgrimage of thoughts to go and visit his father's hometown, because they're really putting a lot of emphasis on trying to peel France out of the NATO fold. And I think they're on a hiding to nothing on that one personally, but that seems to be what they're aiming for. But if you consider that you've got the European Union, who have failed to negotiate any kind of peace in, well, they were lying about Ukraine with the Minsk Accord. They just flat out were fraudulent in that, as they've now admitted internationally, Merkel and Hollande. They never had any intention of seeing that the Ukrainians went through with that deal from 2015. So that really diminished their mediating reputation. Then you had that speech that von der Leyen gave that we discussed, where she had the kind of like a contradictory presentation that was attacked by the Chinese, who basically said that she had to make amends and educate herself when she came to visit them. So you're going to have this incredible situation that while she's meeting in the People's Palace with President Xi, his foreign minister is going to be supervising a final get-together between the foreign minister of Iran and the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia, like down the street. So talk about an example of superpower statesmanship. I mean, it really is rubbing her nose into the fact that, you know, her organization, if not her personally, has been a failure for the last 8 years. And the Chinese, in the space of 8 months, are being incredibly successful. And unfortunately, her foreign minister, Joseph Borrell, the foreign minister for the European Commission, has, as is his way, gone and put his foot very much in his mouth, went to the NATO foreign ministers meeting, where he literally is like an add-on, because the European Union per se is not a signatory of the NATO charter, but because they're the kind of supranational body for so many of the independent countries, he kind of like gets invited along to these get-togethers. So he's standing next to Blinken, the Secretary of State, like the Foreign Minister for the United States, and he starts attacking China and saying that they're not fulfilling their international responsibilities and their international obligations by essentially not sanctioning Russia and not condemning them in the Security Council. And given that his boss was literally driving to the airport to get an overnight flight to meet President Xi, having just days beforehand given her own speech that was exceptionally badly received by the Chinese, like all he had to do was say nothing. And instead he was like really attacking their honesty and their good faith and their reputation, which is very important to the Chinese. So he really hit their bad boy buttons. And I don't think that that's going to go uncommented on. The Chinese media sometimes are a little bit slow to respond because they like draft something, give it to somebody to make sure they're not going to get their head chopped off, and then kind of like publish it 12 hours later. So it'll be very interesting to see in a few hours what their kind of top 5 papers have to say about that speech, or whether or not, because she will literally be hot off the plane, they're gonna let it slide. But personally, I don't see how they can let that slide. I mean, he was just flat out really rude, and it, they're feeling very strong at the moment. So I don't think that there's any need for them to be submissive. And it was interesting that at the same meeting, even though he had been roundly condemned on several grounds that I had discussed with you on our previous show for the actions of the Japanese government, the foreign minister of Japan had flown straight from China to Europe, and he was appearing with all these NATO foreign ministers twice, once today and once tomorrow, even though Japan's not even an official member of NATO. So the Chinese had specifically said, you have to step off the American path. They are going the wrong way, is what they said, right? Which is the whole point about strategic autonomy, strategic independence, right? Don't walk in lockstep behind the Americans as they like walk off a cliff, metaphorically speaking, right? And there he is chumming up with Blinken. So that's going to put a lot more strain on relations between Japan and China. But at the same time as that was going badly, the Malaysian Prime Minister has been doing a victory lap, having come back with a pledge for an additional $38.5 billion US dollars. So what's that, like 55, 60 billion Australian dollars in new infrastructure projects that the Chinese are going to finance in Malaysia. And true to their request for him to take the Chinese pledge, not only was he expressing his undying gratified for the extra 60 billion Oz of new railways, roads and airports and 5G and stuff, but he was saying, why don't we form an Asian monetary fund that won't be dominated like the International Monetary Fund that's like 27% owned by America? So that almost gives them like a blocking vote on any proposal.
Yep.
And so he said, let's just run it ourselves in Asia. And he said, just to start off the bat, we're going to stop using the dollar, and instead we're going to use the Malaysian ringgit, the Indian rupee, and the Chinese yuan for all of our export and import deals.
Wow. This would now make sense because we've now heard from Marco Rubio, one way or another, by being very concerned that the US is going to lose superpower status in all of this, Simon.
That's very true. And if you have it available, you have the short clip to use there. But what he basically was saying was, in a few years' time, America won't be able to apply economic sanctions on countries and freeze their bank accounts because these people aren't going to be using the American dollar. And that's exactly true. They destroyed the reputation of the American dollar by seizing all the Russian accounts. Obviously, that had already been done with the Venezuelans, the Iranians, and the Cubans in the past. But to be honest, a lot of people hadn't paid that much attention. They were all kind of peripheral countries, and they just didn't see their circumstances applying to them. But this whole kind of Russia-Ukraine issue is more relatable. And now sanctions being put on Chinese individuals and companies in the form of secondary sanctions have got a lot of other countries saying, like, why exactly do we want to have 50% of our national reserves in dollars? Like, why can't they be Singapore dollars or yuan or yen or something else that's far less likely to get seized. So this is a comment that the Iranian leader Khamenei was saying today on the series of tweets that he put out. He said, in terms of the reputation of the US dollar as a reserve currency, the Americans have literally shot themselves in the foot, was the expression that he used. And once again, you look at what's going on and you're like, I haven't been either looking or agreeing with this guy for 20 years. And like suddenly everything he's saying is true and makes sense.
So, in what we're watching here, so Marco Rubio makes a very important point that that the US dollar is helping the US lose its superpower status in all of this. It points to two things. One is that US sanctions don't will no longer have the clout that they once have if other countries are using other currencies, their own, perhaps. And also the idea of Macron visiting China and having a very personal tour says to me that perhaps China's got something up their sleeve in terms of fracturing the NATO alliance by revealing maybe a secret down the track. Why are we seeing these counter moves at this point in time? You would think that Macron is a globalist of the highest order, but there seems to be something here in France maybe playing a bigger role than we otherwise can see right now.
Well, they know that his domestic position in France is extremely weak. So if he can announce some, $50 billion of Chinese investments or something, then, they might think that would be helpful to him. But frankly, I think any deal of that size would be insufficient to counter the amount of political opposition that currently exists against Macron. You've got to remember that almost straight after Macron and von der Leyen leave, then Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, is turning up. And then she's going to go straight from Beijing to Tokyo for the G7 meeting. And apparently after that, the Germans are going to be publishing their national strategy towards China. And so that's going to be, obviously Germany are by far the largest economy in the European Union. And that's going to be enormously important. So if this meeting goes badly with Macron and or von der Leyen, bear in mind that they are heads of state and she is kind of like two ranks below them. She's obviously going to get briefed the day before she arrives on what's happened with them. We'll then have to see if there's any dichotomy or break between Germany and France on that regard, which I wouldn't anticipate. And then when they publish that document, if that puts in writing a negative outcome, then as far as the Chinese are concerned, that's it, you're done. Forget about any more inward investment from China into the European Union. And you've got to remember that the Europeans are planning for astronomical quantities of solar panels over the next 5 years to be imported from China to Europe to try and meet their green energy targets. So if they have a major falling out with the Chinese, they don't have any other source for the raw materials. There's no readily available substitute imports to come from, say, India or somewhere in South America or some other cheap manufacturing location. And their kind of green dreams go out the window. So they've got a lot at stake on this relationship. But as far as the Chinese are concerned, they're not only happy dealing with the Russians, but they want to deal with the ASEANs, with all of the Middle East, with India. That's billions more people. And the Saudis are rich, and the UAE is rich, and Qatar and Bahrain. And it's not like, the French are the only people with $2 to rub together. They can sell their stuff somewhere else, just like the Russians are selling their oil and their gas and their coal somewhere else.
Yeah, look, you pause and take a big breath in all of this, and you wonder what's going on in the Davos set. What would Klaus Schwab be doing right now? It's just suddenly not going to plan any of this, and they're realizing that they have an opposition. It's something that we'll pause and just think about for just a moment, because I want to cross now to Jacinda Ardern has stood down as the Prime Minister of New Zealand, but all of a sudden she's picked up not one but two roles, and this is possibly the greatest insult to our intelligence so far. But we'll bring up the first headline here. This is: Prince William has tapped former New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern for a major new role. And she's going to be involved with this particular pet project, which just happens to be as a seat on the board of his conservation initiative, the Earthshot Prize. The former New Zealand PM has been appointed by the Prince of Wales as a trustee of the prize, which aims to find solutions to the world's biggest environmental challenges. Simon.
Well, the backstory to that is apparently that entire organisation was her idea before he became Prince of Wales in her early years as New Zealand's Prime Minister. So she's literally going back onto the board of the charity that she suggested to him like 5 or 6 years ago. So, I mean, talk about, revolving doors there. So that basically is ticking the first globalist agenda for innovation for climate change. And then I'll allow you to introduce the second thing, another globalist pet project.
Let's have a look at this. So Jacinda Ardern to begin a new role combating online extremism. And for a bit more detail, New Zealand Prime Minister Chris Hipkins, who took over as the leader from Ardern, announced Tuesday he'd appointed Ardern as special envoy for the Christchurch call. Hipkins said Ardern would begin the part-time role this month, right after she leaves Parliament, and that she declined to accept any pay. He said the role would be reviewed at the end of the year. What's going on, Simon?
Well, you've got to bear in mind that where they talk about extremism there, obviously that doesn't include Nazis, otherwise they wouldn't be allowed to talk to Zelensky. So what they're actually doing is trying to crack down, along with UNESCO, on misinformation and disinformation. So that's just a massive censorship scheme. But that's very much for her heart, isn't it? When she was the New Zealand Prime Minister with all the lockdowns and people were trying to push back against the unscientific nature of the draconian measures that she was enforcing in New Zealand, she was saying that the New Zealand government should be the only trusted source of information.
Yes.
So for somebody with that mindset to suddenly now take a kind of global censorship role, you're not going to be enjoying your free speech much longer there, are you?
This is it. It's like that. They still think that they control the narrative that well that the general public just cannot wake up, that they're completely comatose. But it feels like moves like these are at the stage when we're seeing world leaders just jump the shark. We're seeing Biden's off the planet, as we've seen for some time now. The charges against Trump are just something else that you've even got people on the left saying that it's just reeks of political point scoring. Now you've got Ardern, who has been caught red-handed manipulating the information in the during the pandemic, now getting a board. Oh, but she's doing it for free on the misinformation board. It wouldn't matter if she paid us billions of dollars to be on the board. It's still not worth having a dishonest politician in such a position. But it's very, very obvious now that the globalists have revealed their hand, and that for the first time ever there is massive pushback, and China is, after moving very, very slowly for a very long period of time, and what they're talking about once in a century change, it's like all their ducks are in a row now, and China are moving this along at a speed we've never ever seen before. And this is the third news update that we've done together in the space of, or in less than a week, Simon, and just the developments of those three separate bulletins are something to behold, aren't they?
It's like they've been saying, sometimes there are decades where nothing happens, and sometimes there are weeks where decades worth of information occur.
And yet, yeah, here we are.
Here we are. I mean, people need to appreciate that whilst this has been another hour-long broadcast or something, and there are certain topics that we're going into detail to try and join the dots in the background, so you just don't see the front of the picture, but you see what's in the background of the picture as well. We still haven't fed in all the pieces of the puzzle there yet. Now, for most of us, it's pretty obvious what's going on. But to your average, normie, sleeping Joe Blow, they're finding it a bit hard to really figure out exactly what's happening at the moment. I'm sure your audience are much more astute than that. And they've been listening to you for a good while and listening to Nicola and really understand what the globalists and the WEF are up to. But these new things like the Greater Eurasian Partnership and even the membership of the Gulf Cooperation Council and the background to the disagreements between the Iranians and the Bahrainians and the Saudis and stuff like that, frankly, for most people, that it's an overwhelming amount of detail. But when you start to understand these things, then it doesn't just give you a good sense of history, but it enables you to understand the magnitude of the changes. These are, really, really huge geopolitical shifts that are happening just on a daily basis. And now, we know how I mentioned to you when we last did a recording together that Xi Jinping had insisted that the Russian Prime Minister call the Chinese Premier quickly so that they could start implementing all these deals, right?
Mm-hmm.
That happened today, that call.
Yeah.
And then the Chinese Premier said to him, thank you for calling, like you were told. Now get all your ministers and deputy ministers to call all the people who work for me and let's get the show on the road like next week. So we're talking about multiple levels of government engagement happening within days.
Yeah.
Whereas normally these people would still be recovering from their hangovers from celebrating the first leg of the deal, let alone being told, oh, we need to do leg 3 by the end of the month.
Yes.
And that's exactly what's happening between the Saudis and the Iranians. Now, once again, I had a conversation with you 2 days ago, and we kind of between us figured out the reason for why they were rushing the exchange of ambassadors so that they had full diplomatic relations before Raisi, the president of Iran, went to meet the king of Saudi Arabia. So there was a diplomatic technical reason why that had to be done first. But once again, that could have been, a week or a month. It was 2 days, and now it's all in the media again. The Iranians saying, oh, we're really looking forward to it, and we hope that happens as soon as possible. And the Saudis saying, thank you ever so much for accepting our invitation and stuff. Literally, just praising each other ceaselessly and saying that as soon as we've got this out the way, can't wait to start doing business. And once again, it's not some theoretical pie in the sky kind of net zero, right? This is you and you, I want this done in a week. I want 2 years worth of work done in a week. And what has me a little bit concerned, even though I'm watching this incredibly closely and I have a good understanding, I think, and if I don't, I ask people, as to what is occurring. And I understand, and I'm sure many of your listeners are starting to understand the whole scheme with the new era and the Greater Eurasian Partnership. But I think everyone at this point should be asking themselves, why is it happening so fast? And why are they now not only admitting it, but celebrating it? That there is a penny to drop. So whether it's because they think that the West is going to go bust, or there's going to be some big revelation about Biden, or the source of COVID, or whether or not one of those things will be used to bring down the West, there really seems to be an incredible sense of urgency to put mechanisms in place between so many nations that the only parallel that makes me even more concerned is the word resilience. So if they think potentially, and I'm not saying this is going to happen like next week, but if they think that potentially, maybe because of the banks, maybe they figure there's going to be 10 more Credit Suisses, right?
Yeah.
That there's going to be a financial collapse and they don't want to be dragged down with them, then they need to put parallel organizations that are fully functional in place beforehand.
Yes, this makes sense. And the other interesting part of it is that it's very, very hard now to look at this critically and think that China or Russia are actually pushing for World War III if all they're concerned about is peace breaking out in the Middle East, business deals coming together all around the world, and actually showing France around and offering them business deals. This is far from a world intent on blowing itself up.
No. The only reason that is going to happen is if the Americans realize that literally that they need to do a nuclear exchange in order to be able to do a debt jubilee on their terms. And they'll coordinate the G7 central banks with the World Bank, IMF, and the Bank of International Settlements, and basically say, right, we're cancelling everyone's property deeds, but we're also going to cancel everyone's mortgages. We're going to cancel everyone's credit card debt. We're going to cancel your car payments because we're going to confiscate all your cars because that's ruining the environment. And we're going to close all the banks and confiscate all of your bank accounts, and you're going to be reissued digital currencies. I mean, if they were to do all of that all at once in a week or 2 weeks with all of the banks closed, maybe power blackouts, people say that's ridiculous. That would never happen. Okay, look at Poland. Look at Cyprus when they did the bail-ins there. And you have to remember that the Cyprus model is the law for America and Canada and the European Union now. It's to take people's bank deposits. Now, SVB and Signature Bank happened in a timing not of their choosing. So they weren't ready for it. But if they're going to do it to 500 or 1,000 banks simultaneously worldwide, they're going to pick their day and time. And if they can't pick their day and time, the only way they avoid being dragged out of their parliament and hung from the nearest lamppost is if there's literally a world war going on. Because what else would stop the people from revolting if they got told you don't own your house anymore and you've got no bank account left at all? Like none.
Yeah.
At that point, you don't have much left to lose.
We're not far off. Yeah.
I mean, once again, here you and I aren't making a forecast about what's going to happen in a month's time. We're just looking at everything and saying this doesn't make sense, but for one of these 3 or 4 scenarios. And so your callers shouldn't call in a month's time and say, hey, I've still got my bank account. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that 3/4 of the world, the people who aren't part of the golden billion, are just about to change the way in which they all interact. And where the remainder who aren't going through that type of transition, the transition that we're going through is our gender, our energy supply, our identity, our culture, and our currency. Which I have to say, when I'm looking at these statements that came out today from Lavrov and that came out from the Iranians, and the joint statement, interestingly enough, that came out in Oman, and also the statement in relation to Iran from the King of Bahrain, he put out quite a rare kind of like philosophical statement. And not only did he express happiness at the breakout of peace across the Middle East, which is cause for happiness from every good-minded person, right? But he specifically pointed out that was occurring without interference in the internal affairs of each country and without challenging their cultures or traditions. And I keep on banging this point again and again, and I'm sorry if it gets boring, but nobody in the West is talking about this because they're pushing their extreme liberal agenda, and all these other countries are saying, we're not doing that. And they're telling it in writing, normally in the final or penultimate paragraph of their press releases. And it's like, it's not a puzzle. It's not a puzzle. It's like, no, you guys want to do that? That's fine. You stay over there. We're going to do this over here. And we'll be friends with you, but not if you keep on attacking us, or not if you keep on pushing that through your movies and through the internet and through your president and your secretary of state and your White House press spokeswoman saying that LGBTQ is the foundation or cornerstone of your entire foreign policy. It's like, remember the famous book written by Samuel Huntington? It was called The Clash of Civilization. I've been looking back at that now, and that was from 30 years ago, more than that, 35 years ago. I think it came out in 89. And we really seem to be at that point. But it's not between the talking points that we get from the West about between democracies and autocracies, or between capitalists and communists. It's between social liberals and social conservatives on an international basis. And that is the cultural clash. And I mean, that's been evident in terms of, what you could get away with in terms of, sex or intercourse being shown in a movie that would be acceptable with a 13 or 15 age rating in Australia or England would never, ever be shown at the cinema in Saudi Arabia. But the West has gone to such an extreme extent that the other countries are not just saying, I'm going to clip that minute out of the movie. They're saying, no, like, you can't show that movie at all. We don't want anything to do with that. Don't come in.
Yeah.
So
this is
I mean, that's the difference. We're not arguing about technicalities on the periphery of our relationship. When these beliefs become the raison d'etre for the entire US diplomatic service to exist, you see it with them flying the multicolored flags outside the US embassies.
Yes.
Even in like places like Kazakhstan and Russia and stuff like that, literally to like flip them the bird. And that, I mean, so it's not been instantaneous. This has been a while in coming. But what's interesting is that their typical divide and conquer technique is now exhausted. People have got over the financial fear. They've got over the political fear. They've unified, and now they're pushing back.
It has been an incredible report, Simon. This is starting to put these pieces together in the background. The rate of knots has got everyone on the edge of their seats because at long last there are moves afoot for something to give after a very, very long period of time. And if we started the story today with Donald Trump's arraignment and 34 felony charges, a story that's been brewing for 7 or 8 years now, and one wonders if this is going to turn on its head or flip at some stage. Trump is not out of the running for 2024, and we're seeing that all the work that he did on his world tour with Saudi Arabia and China and meeting up with Putin and the rest of it, maybe there is something cooking behind it. That all is a story for another day. We've provided an incredible amount of information. Thank you, Simon, for what has been an absolutely riveting piecing together of the world events, starting in Victoria with building collapses, the AstraZeneca and the destruction of 40 million vaccine vials here in Australia, at a time when Jacinda Ardern is being appointed on a board to report back to her Prime Minister on misinformation, her must-have egg on her face, and China doing deals in the Middle East and even with France. It is truly an extraordinary time. What a time it is to be alive. Thank you, Simon. I look forward to the next report, and we'll leave it there for today. This has been another edition of World Series News, and I look forward to seeing you all on the next show. Please share far and wide.